Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of On the Grid Podcast, Season 4, Episode 24. We are about halfway through the summer break now. The countdown towards the Dutch Grand Prix is definitely on. But we're coming back with an episode where we're going to have a bit of a 2025 grid talk. Because why not? There's only 4 seats available left on the grid. And if we actually look on the grid, it's at Mercedes, RB, Alpine, and Sauber. But before we get into the episode, let's introduce ourselves. I'm your host, Adrian. Joining me, as ever, is my co-host, Ethan Evans. Ethan, how are you today? How are you kind of enjoying a little bit of a hiatus, a little bit of a wind down? And how are you keeping yourself sane, not watching any F1?
It's a bit of a welcome break. I think the summer break came at a good time. Sort of we can reset, readjust. The football season's starting, so there's not exactly any lack of sport either. You've got the Olympics as well, of course. But yeah, no, looking forward to the Dutch Grand Prix in just a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, like you say, the football season's back. Many of our fans will know that I'm a Stags fan, so I'll start the season off very, very well. I'm very, very happy. I mean, as we're recording this, Mansfield are playing Bolton and the Carabao Cup first round, so hopefully there's a progression through to the second round as we did well last season in that competition. But less about the football, more about the F1. Let's talk about Red Bull. Let's begin with our Constructors' Championship leaders for the time being. They've got a pairing of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez in 2025. Let's begin about talking about Max, Ethan, because there's certainly a little bit of interest from Mercedes there for Max Verstappen. We've seen numerous team bosses and key figures leave Red Bull Racing. Do you see Max Verstappen swayed into making a decision away from Red Bull, or do you think he's going to be the key man for Red Bull for the years to come?
Now, this is a difficult one. I think he'll be there next season. Beyond that is a different question. I don't think he'll see out his Formula One career at Red Bull. I think he will move on at some stage, whether that's 2026, whether that's later, who knows? But I think there's been a sort of a chink in the armor there at Red Bull. Because before, if you asked me 12 months ago, I'd say no, he's going to drive for Red Bull his entire career and retire there. I think we've seen some sort of issues under the surface at Red Bull, and maybe he is not as fully committed to Red Bull as once thought, with all the controversy that's happened. And now, obviously, Red Bull have been caught up by the likes of McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But no, for 2025, I don't think there is any chance he will be leaving Red Bull.
So are you most certainly squashing any of the rumours that Mercedes are going to snap him up for 2025, maybe 2026 then?
Well, I think there's another man that is going to get that seat. It's all but confirmed. But 2026, you can never say never. Who would have thought Lewis Hamilton would have gone to Ferrari at the start of the year? So again, that looks set as if, Hamilton would see out his career at Mercedes, obviously been there for a decade now and that he would continue to be there. But here we are. So I'm not going to say no, but it's possible, let's see what happens. You can never predict silly season, can you?
On to the second driver at Red Bull, Sergio Perez. A lot of us uncertainty about his place in the system there. Literally, the only note I've got here for Sergio Perez is one word, and it is uncertainty, purely on the basis of his performances in the first half of the 2024 season. His 2023 season, don't get me wrong, it wasn't amazing either. So there's probably a lot of mixed emotions for Red Bull fans when Sergio Perez had his contract extended before the Monaco Grand Prix, and we've seen what's happened after that. Ethan, we've seen pictures of Lauren Mekies, Christian Horner, etc., with a certain Daniel Ricciardo. We've seen pictures of Max Verstappen, Jos Verstappen, and Daniel Ricciardo in a helicopter together. What conversations do you think have been had there? Do you think that Daniel Ricciardo could be destined for a return to Red Bull? And do you think that maybe it's a little bit of a injustice to a certain Yuki Tsunoda that he's not been allowed to step up to Red Bull Racing?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that there are conversations going on at Red Bull whether they promote Daniel Ricciardo or whether they stick with Sergio Perez. I think Yuki Tsunoda would be very, very unlucky not to be given a shot, but it just doesn't look like he's on their radar, which is very strange because the one thing you've got to say about Red Bull is that they do put the trust in the young drivers. They are very cutthroat. They're very much, if you don't perform from day one, you're out. But they've always been a team that's given that opportunity, and they don't look like it now. They've sort of changed their philosophy a bit. Appointing Sergio Perez in the first place when they've got the driver academy is one thing. But no, it's interesting to see because I think Yuki Tsunoda deserves that seat, but I don't think he'll get it, and that's political. But it is what it is. At the end of the day, I think Tsunoda has to get a move. Moving forward, he has to get a move out of that Red Bull camp because we've seen drivers like Alex Albon flourish once they've left.
And with Sergio Perez, do you think that maybe potentially with him being one of the more older, experienced drivers on the grid, do you think that maybe his time's up in a top team, maybe he drops down to, let's say, a Sauber or an Alpine to see out of it, to see out the rest of his F1 career if Red Bull fire him, or does he pack up and retire completely?
It's difficult because I don't see where the seat is necessarily. The only one I can see is Sauber, and I'm sure they'd be willing to give him a shot. Go moving into Audi, that could be a good project for him. But how willing is he to go down the order after driving for the quickest team for the last 3 years, 3 or 4 years? That begs the question. But there we are. I don't think Sergio Perez will be in the Red Bull next season. Spoiler alert. But he's definitely deserving a place in Formula One. There's a reason he got the Red Bull seat for 5, 6, 7 years of top quality performances in the midfield. But yeah, I doubt we'll see him at Red Bull next season.
Let's move on to McLaren. P2 in the Constructors' Championship. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri confirmed for next season and beyond. It's obvious. That was obvious. A very, very young driver pairing. Both race winners now. It's obvious that McLaren have put in trust in their youth and have got Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris in the forefront of a project, and hopefully they can propel them into stardom and into glory in 2024 and maybe even beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was any doubt, even at the start of the season, if you look forward to 2025, that these two would be there. The only question mark would be if Red Bull came in for Norris, but that was squashed quite quickly. I think that was squashed last year even. And they both seem very settled. They should be competing for the championship next season. Let's be real. This season is it like I've said many times, it's just a step too far with Verstappen performing how he is, and he also had that buffer from like the first 4 or 5 races when that Red Bull was dominant. But I think it is a matter of time until McLaren are fighting for championships, but they need both drivers to be competing for wins on a regular basis. And we're 14 races into the season. McLaren have had the quickest car for over half of that. They've only got 1 win each. Mercedes have more wins. Ferrari have the same number of wins. So there'll be no change for years to come at McLaren, I'm sure. But they should be competing at a high level.
And potentially, do you think that the relationship, well, especially after what we saw in Budapest, do you think that for year, like you said, there might not be likely any changes in the lineup for the years to come? Do you think that it could potentially get a little bit troublesome with who's the number one driver, who's going to get the preferential treatment? Do you think that maybe a little bit of an ego side might creep into one or the other?
Well, obviously Norris thinks he should be number one. He's been at the team longer. He's been there and done it. And he's been through the hard times as well. And he's the McLaren youth driver. He's sort of the golden boy. He was seen by McLaren as the next Lewis Hamilton. He was brought through the system. He was given that chance in Formula One, and he's done well to this point. And now you've got someone like Oscar Piastri who has bags of potential. And it disrupts the rhythm a little bit because Oscar Piastri is a fantastic driver. We've seen that. Now he's at a level where he can compete with Lando Norris on a consistent basis. There are still slight holes to him as a driver, but he's working on that. He's ironing them out, and we saw a brilliant win in Hungary for Oscar Piastri, and then he followed that up in Belgium and was the better of the two McLarens. And you got to say this season it's been very, very tight between those two. Um, and maybe that's unsettled Lando a little bit. And, it's easy being all friendly when you're driving a midfield car. It's very different when you're driving a race winning car.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to Ferrari, a team that you'll be looking at very closely for next season with your man Lewis Hamilton joining and joining my man Charles Leclerc. It could be a dream duo like the two of us on the podcast, but what I've got written down on here, could it potentially get a little bit troublesome? My only thinking behind that, Charles Leclerc obviously not wanting to part way with his number one driver role at Ferrari. Lewis Hamilton is definitely not coming in to be a number two driver at Ferrari. Do you think, similarly to McLaren, do you think that it could get troublesome with both of these drivers wanting the absolute best out of the car, wanting the most upgrades possible during a given weekend? Do you think that it could get a little bit troublesome? I mean, it could be a match made in heaven for all we know, but these two drivers are definitely not wanting to settle for a number two role. Both of these are number one drivers without a doubt.
I mean, I don't think it'll be too different from what setup is now. I think it'll be a sort of a level playing field because you can say Leclerc's the number one driver, and I think he is viewed as that future world champion. But based on performance, I think you've got to say they're very evenly matched, Leclerc and Sainz. I know Leclerc has beaten Sainz in two of the three seasons compared to Sainz's one. But last season it was very, very tight, and it was only Leclerc that overtook Sainz on sort of the last race of the season to clinch to beat his teammate, whereas Sainz was leading for majority of the season. So I think it will be a very level playing field, and it could be the making of Leclerc. It could benefit him fantastically in the years to come, watching Hamilton picking up little habits of his and seeing how he operates and seeing how sort of the statistical greatest driver of all time and how he operates. So it could really, really benefit Leclerc.
With that being said, like you said, this season and the seasons have gone by with Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc as a duo. It has been a little bit of a playing field, but we all know that Charles Leclerc is given that status a little bit of being Ferrari's golden boy. And do you reckon that could play into the hands of Charles Leclerc a little bit with Lewis Hamilton joining in, or do you think that Lewis Hamilton being this seven-time world champion, potentially gunning for an eighth, do you reckon he's going to be thrusted more into the limelight? Do you think he's going to be the one leading the project for Ferrari in 2025 and 2026?
If Ferrari develop a championship winning car, who do you trust more to deliver, to be fair? So it will be a level playing field, and it should be, because that's how it's always been for Lewis Hamilton, really, throughout his career. You look at Fernando Alonso, you look at Jenson Button, Nico Rosberg, even Bottas. He was always on a level playing field. There was no preferential treatment unless, Hamilton was competing for the championship and his teammate wasn't. There was never sort of a hierarchy, and that will continue, I believe. I think that'll continue with Leclerc. But again, like I said, who would you trust more to deliver a championship for Ferrari? Leclerc does have mistakes in him. I don't think anybody would deny that. And Lewis Hamilton, he's a seven-time world champion for a reason. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm sure it'll be a very, very competitive duo. But, from both their perspective, they want to be driving the team forward because they're not in a position at the minute where they are going to be competing for the championship next season on the face of it.
Well, we saw what happened last time when Charles Leclerc was battling for a championship. So I think that answers my question. That answers your question. I mean, regardless of who is in the limelight for Ferrari, both of these drivers are more than capable of becoming champions in their own right once again. For Lewis Hamilton and champion for the first time for Charles Leclerc. Multiple race winners, pole positions galore, podiums amongst the two of them as well. Let's move on to Mercedes, a team that you'll be departing next season. George Russell, the new man to lead Mercedes forward. I think he's got that pedigree in abundance, I think, now, learning off Lewis Hamilton, especially. Obviously, unfortunate not to get that win in Belgium last time out due to his disqualification. But let's not talk about him. Let's talk about the rumours on the block. Who comes in? Who steps in? There's rumours of Bottas. There's rumours of Antonelli. There's rumours of Mick Schumacher, because he's in a driver program for Mercedes, and even dare I say Max Verstappen. But I think we've kind of squashed that. Who do you reckon replaces Lewis Hamilton? Who's the man to pair up with George Russell and to keep the Mercedes rear gunners going and to keep their championship beliefs alive after a bit of a gap and a bit of a hiatus from being at the top of the championship order?
I mean, a few weeks ago, I probably said Antonelli is probably a bit too raw and could do with another season in F2. But based on the recent performances before the summer break, I think he is sort of nailed on. I've heard that he's even going to be announced at Monza, which is his home race. It's obviously the F2 is there at the same weekend. And I've heard that he will be announced as Mercedes driver next season at that Grand Prix. So I really can't see past him, and I think it'll be interesting to see how he performs against Russell. He's, very tough teammates come up against, and see what happens moving forwards. But yeah, I don't see anybody except for Antonelli taking that seat.
Talking about Kimi Antonelli, if we look delving into the F2 championship order, he's seventh in the championship, 78 points behind leader Isaac Hadjar. Is it too early for him? Is it for him to? I mean, we'll talk about Ollie Behrman a little bit later on, but he's a long way down the championship order, and he's secured an F1 seat purely on the basis of his performance for Ferrari at Saudi Arabia. Do you think that it may be a little bit too early for Antonelli, especially being so young and so raw? Obviously going from F4 straight into F2 and then thrust into the limelight of F1.
Quite possibly, yeah. But I think Kramer have had their issues this season. And look how he's performing against Antonelli. He's wiping the floor with him, and Antonelli's been, oh, sorry, Behrman. Look how Behrman's been sort of portrayed in the media about, and then rightly so, because he was fantastic in his outing at Jeddah. But at the end of the day, Behrman has that seat as well. He has a seat confirmed for 2025, and Antonelli has been outperforming him for, you got to say, all season, really. So, it'll be interesting to see, but I think I don't think there'll be any issues, really. I think Antonelli has the potential. It might take him a season to get up to speed, to get up to the level of George Russell, and that could hinder Mercedes' chances in 2025, given that they've got 3 wins already this season, and have a car, maybe that could compete for more race wins for the rest of the season and next year. But I think they're looking at it as a long-term fix and looking at it as he's going to be here for a decade. So if you look at it like that, I think you can take a year to get him up to speed in order for the potential that he's got.
On to Aston Martin, who are our fifth team here in our kind of look over the 2025 grid. Fernando Alonso, Lance Stroll. My notes for Aston Martin: Fernando Alonso, statement of intent. For Lance Stroll, statement of non-existent intent. Because Lance Stroll is always going to get that F1 seat for however long his father is supporting the Aston Martin team. Fernando Alonso, he had rumours of potentially joining Mercedes. Those were squashed after he had his contract extended by Aston Martin, which is an excellent piece of business. We know that Aston Martin not have necessarily gone a little bit backwards ever since kind of the start of this season and the back end of last season. And are kind of nowhere near the top 4 teams in the championship. Fernando Alonso, multiple race winner, a world champion in his own right, and Lance Stroll, a one. I believe he's had 1 pole position and a couple of podiums in his racing point days. How do you think the Aston Martin team will fare? I reckon it could potentially be all down to the 2025 car and how they've developed it so far. But they certainly are banking on Fernando Alonso on him staying for another couple of years.
Well, not according to rumor mill, calling that they want Verstappen for 2026, and Stroll's going to keep that seat, isn't he? So maybe they don't. There's been a bit of, like I said, with Verstappen, there's been a bit of disruption over the last few races. Look at Alonso in sort of how his body language is. He doesn't seem very happy with that team and the car. Obviously, where they were at the start of the season, they were very, very smart in getting him nailed down early, because if he still wasn't signed on, you've got to say, would he sign on for next season, or would he look for another seat? Because that car has dropped down the order massively. But it's interesting, isn't it? We've got to wait and see what happens. But I don't see anything happening over, at least for next season. Obviously, they're both confirmed, Alonso and Stroll. But for the next few years, I don't think there will be a change. I think it will be very much Alonso will call it quits, and then they'll look to replace him. But Stroll's going to be there for the foreseeable.
Yeah, which I absolutely hate, and you probably absolutely hate as well. But like we say, until Lawrence Stroll is pumping money into Aston Martin, Lance Stroll is always going to be in daddy's cash, and he's always going to have that F1 seat forever and ever. Let's move on to our VCOB team, Racing Bulls. Yuki Tsunoda announced ahead of 2025, heading into his fifth season at the team. I reckon he's going to be a one to watch out for in 2025, as he'll probably be wanting a step up in 2026. And then a seat has been opened for the Racing Bulls team. There's rumours of Liam Lawson potentially stepping in. Daniel Ricciardo is also on the radar if he doesn't get a Red Bull seat. And maybe potentially an outside bet of Ayumu Iwasa, a double Japanese pairing, which could be a little bit interesting. I know Ayumu I believe, is in Super Formula this season, and he's doing fairly well. So who do you think is replacing, let's put in quotation marks, Daniel Ricciardo if he goes to Red Bull? Do you maybe even see Sergio Perez dropping down to Racing Bulls? Is that potentially on the cards? But do you think? I think it will likely be more Liam Lawson nailed on. What are your thoughts, Ethan? Do you think that the kind of a Kiwi is expected to be filling that second driver role at Racing Bulls next season?
Well, I think Lawson has to be in F1. It was controversial that he wasn't had a seat this season, given how well he performed last year in the sort of 6 or 7 races he stepped in. But to not have him next season would be absolutely outrageous. And I think it comes down to Ricardo will either be at Red Bull or not in the sport next season, and that is crazy to say. But again, Perez will either be at Red Bull or not in the Red Bull family. He won't drop down to RB, I don't think. I can't see that happening. So then it boils down to what do Red Bull do? Do they make a change? Do they decide no, Perez is their man, they're going to stick by him? And then what does that mean for Daniel Ricciardo? Because I don't think Daniel Ricciardo will be at RB next season. Like I said, Lawson has to be in that seat. Tsunoda's confirmed. Lawson has to be there. And I think he will.
On to Haas, who have had both of their drivers confirmed in Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman, after Esteban Ocon was axed from Alpine, and Ollie Behrman, of course, making that step up to Haas after his fine performance in Saudi for Ferrari. Let's talk about Ollie Behrman. Obviously, that performance in Jeddah kind of springs to mind, replacing Carlos Sainz, who had appendicitis and had to step out of a car, giving the young British driver a bit of freedom and a chance to prove himself, and he did with a fine points finish. And Esteban Ocon kind of dropping down a little bit, but could you say it's a drop off? Could you say it's a step up potentially with Haas being ahead of Alpine in the Constructors' Championship at the moment? Do you think that both drivers are maybe looking up rather than down? Because Haas have definitely not been the slowest car on the grid. They've shown their weaknesses, but most and foremost, they've shown that they are not in it just to be the back of the grid. They're in it to fight for points, and especially with Nico Hulkenberg showing his class and Kevin Magnussen showing his defensive abilities for his teammates. Haas are definitely not a team to kind of push over ahead of 2025.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued to see how that driver lineup works next season because Esteban Ocon is not exactly considered a friendly teammate. Look at the sort of the issues he's had previously with pretty much every single teammate he's ever had. And then you got Ollie Behrman coming into the team. I will be very, very interested to see what happens if Behrman starts off the season very strongly and is actually beating Ocon. I'll be very, very interested. So that dynamic of that driver lineup will be very interesting to see. But no, I think that it looks quite strong. It does look quite strong on paper. Ocon is very underrated as a driver. He's outperformed Gasly for much of this season. Yeah, he's the one they're leaving. So it's interesting to see if there's actually any fallout from that, whether there has been sort of behind the scenes, there's been some drama. But I think Behrman coming into that team is a good move. It gives them a fresh set of eyes. It gives them a fresh driver. So yeah, I'm intrigued to see how they perform next season.
If there is any drama, we're likely to see it in the new season of Drive to Survive before the 2025 season starts. So that'll definitely all be covered and displayed. But let's move on to Alpine and Pierre Gasly, obviously, is the lead Frenchman in the team. There's obviously another driver that needs to pair him up as that seat is up for grabs. Let's not talk about Pierre Gasly too much because his quality is there. Just this season, it's not shown because that car is a little bit like a tractor. But the rumor mill, Jack Doohan, Mick Schumacher, probably the leading two who are battling for that driver role. Maybe you can say that Victor Martins or Koshmani, being in the Alpine Academy, they could have a bit of a say in that. But do you think that out of those two, Jack Doohan, Mick Schumacher, who's more nailed on to get that driver role? I think we all know who it is, and we saw him at Silverstone.
I think we did, yeah. It looks like it's going to be Jack Doohan. He's obviously the reserve driver. He's been there for a number of years. And he's sort of seen as the Alpine Academy driver, as the main guy. Whether the other junior drivers could make an impact, who knows? But I think it is pretty nailed on that Jack Doohan will get that seat.
That was quick and nice. Let's move on to a more exciting pairing, Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon at Williams. Nobody expected that from Carlos Sainz. Obviously, he was holding out for potentially a bit of a better role elsewhere. I believe David Coulthard and Eddie Jordan's podcast, they spoke about potentially Carlos Sainz being on the sideline for a year or two and then joining back up at Ferrari whenever Lewis Hamilton was to retire. But he's joined up Williams alongside Alex Albon. Step down, absolutely, for Carlos Sainz. But it definitely does leave his options open for 26 and 27 because he's still on the grid. He's still driving in F1. And he still potentially could make a step up if his performances at Williams are good enough. Because Williams at the moment are ninth in the Constructors' Championship and not doing as well as they did last season. But for Carlos Sainz, a race winner, pole position, podiums galore, do you think that Williams could benefit from his kind of experience and his know-how to propel themselves up the championship order?
I'd be very surprised if there's not a clause in Carlos Sainz's contract that says if one of the big teams come in, then he gets to speak to them. I'll be very, very surprised. I know he's on a multi-year contract, I think it is. I think it's 2+1. But I'd be very surprised if he doesn't have a clause in there because you know how the sort of performance bonuses and the clauses that get added into contract these days across sport, not just in Formula One, but his team would have put something in because obviously it's a step down for Carlos Sainz. But considering the options available, you've got Sauber, who are the worst team completely, and there is no potential next season to do anything. You're banking on Audi hitting the ground running, which is a massive risk. You've got Alpine, who, if you said 12 months ago, you'd probably think that, oh, that's quite an attractive prospect. Obviously, they're a works team. They have their own engine, but now, given their dip in performance, that doesn't. And you look at the backroom staff, what's happening there, the turnover in personnel there doesn't look attractive at all. So then that leaves Williams. Williams look to be going in the right direction. It is a long-term project, but James Vow's done a lot of sweet talking, it seems. He put his all of his effort into signing Science, and it seems to have worked out. But we'll see what happens in the new season. But like I said, I think Science deserves a seat where he can be fighting for podiums and for wins. But the one thing I'm very interested to see is Alex Albon actually the best driver ever, or is he just performing where that car actually is? And you've got Logan Sargent, who's completely underperforming. It'll be very interesting to see how Albon fares up against someone like Carlos Sainz.
On to our final team in our 2025 grid review. Sauber, Nico Hulkenberg joining his old team, heading back to where it all started, likely to be the number one driver, of course. And there's a seat available for another driver in that team. Ethan, who do you think it could be? I know Teo Porcher was linked last season. We saw what happened there. He moved on to IndyCar. He's had plenty of ups and downs so far this season there. Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu are the two current drivers there. Who do you think it could be for 2025 and kind of closing out the grid for next season?
I think it looks more likely as time goes on, it looks more and more likely it's going to be Bottas. I think he's actually performed relatively well compared to his teammate and compared to where that car is, because the car is by a country mile the worst on the grid. And he has had some decent performances that have gone under the radar. So I think he's in pole position to keep that seat for next season, unless they decide to throw it out there and go for one of the young drivers like a Teo Porcher. Maybe they'll go after an F2 driver, but who knows? We'll have to wait and see.
That rounds off our 2025 grid review. Like we say, there's only 4 seats available at the time of recording, which is the 13th of August. We'll have to wait and see who goes where, but I'm sure all of these seats will be announced before the end of the season. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us on another episode of On the Grid Podcast. We'll be back very, very soon with another episode. What will that be? We will not know. We're going to fire you with something very special. I'm very, very sure of that. But in the meantime, thank you for engaging. Thank you for listening, and see you until next time. Goodbye.